Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing our September 2022 Senate election predictions for this fall's midterm. So we're going to be taking a look at all of the non-safe states. Those are states that are technically somewhat competitive. Of course, all of these states already filled out are safe for either party. That means either party will win them by 12 points or more. And ultimately, they're not remotely competitive, and the outcome really isn't going to change in any situation. But for the rest of these states, they are somewhat competitive as we go through them. Of course, some are more competitive than others. So, of course, in this video, we're going to be taking a look mainly at polling for these races. We're also going to factor in political trends for the states, as well as previous election results, and of course the national environment overall and Biden's approval rating, which we'll get to in just a second, because I think ultimately the midterm elections are a referendum on the party and the president in power, and in this case it's the Democratic Party with Joe Biden. So we're going to take a look at all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So before we get into all of the individual races, we're going to take a look at Biden's approval rating overall, because like I mentioned, the midterm elections in politics are often a referendum on the party and president in power, and currently Joe Biden's approval rating is at 42.4% according to FiveThirtyEight, disapproval rating at 53.1. So he's underwater, a little under 11 points. Now, one of the reasons I use FiveThirtyEight as opposed to other websites is because this is the best case scenario for Joe Biden, is that he's underwater by 11. Civics has him underwater by, I believe, like 13 now. Other sites will have varying numbers as well. But the point is, Joe Biden is still unpopular around the nation. And if we take a look at the trend for his approval rating overall, he kind of hit his low point back in July. That was after Dobbs, by the way. And then, of course, slowly over time, as we got closer to the midterms, Democrats, and this was mainly Democrats and some left-leaning independents, coalescing behind Biden ahead of the midterm elections. But it seems like we're kind of at a stagnant stage right now where Joe Biden is kind of underwater 10 or 11 points. And, you know, it might stay that way through to the midterm elections. Of course, we'll have to see. But currently, he's underwater by a little less than 11 points. So now let's dive into some of these individual races. We'll start off with the state of Washington. Now, Washington, again, as I often mention, is not a state that really is traditionally competitive. If we take a look at the Senate election here in Washington, Patty Murray, the Democratic incumbent, is running for a 6th term in the United States Senate against veterans advocate and Republican candidate Tiffany Smiley. Now, one of the reasons why this race had a decent amount of attention put towards it earlier on in the cycle was because Tiffany Smiley was polling somewhat close to Patty Murray, especially early on. Some of these polls had her down by just 9 points, 10 points. A Trafalgar poll has her within 3, which I think is, very interesting to say the least. I think that's definitely overestimating Tiffany Smiley's chances. But nonetheless, for an incumbent Democratic senator in a blue state to be polling on average at around 50 or even below 50% is not exactly a good sign. And again, in the 538 average, Patty Murray's only up by about 10 points. And historically, that's been my prediction for the state of Washington, a 10-point margin of victory for Patty Murray, and I still stand by that. I think at the end of the day, Tiffany Smiley will get around 44% of the vote. Patty Murray will get around 54% of the vote. Again, Washington State tends to be a bit redder in other races besides president. Of course, we could even go back to the previous elections with Patty Murray, going back to even 2010 when Dino Rossi almost, he came within 5 points of beating a Democratic incumbent in, at that time, a very blue state, and still a very blue state. And while it's not 2010 anymore, and I don't expect Tiffany Smiley to get this close in Washington, a 10-point margin of victory nonetheless isn't really the best showing for Tiffany Smiley overall. So I'm going to put this as likely Democrat. I think she will win. I don't think it's going to be that close, but I think a 10-point margin of victory is not really the best sign for Democrats starting off here. And again, it's very, very possible, especially considering the fact that on the same ballot that Joe Biden won the state of Washington by almost 20 percentage points, down ballot, Lauren Culp going up against Governor Jay Inslee got 43% of the vote, only lost this state by around 13 or so, 13 and a half points. So it's really not out of the question that I think Washington will be redder this cycle, especially since Republicans will have more enthusiasm. And despite what some pundits are saying about the Dobbs decision, while that has energized Democrats, certainly Republicans still on average are more enthusiastic and more energized to vote in this midterm. And that's the case still so far. Moving on down to the Silver State, Nevada is a pretty tight race so far between incumbent Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto and Republican former Attorney General Adam Laxalt. So if we take a look at the polling average so far, Laxalt is leading right now by just 1 point according to RCP. I don't really focus too much on 538 because they have consistently vastly overestimated Democrats in every single cycle since 2012. Ultimately, I don't think their aggregates are as reliable as RCP, and as we take a look throughout this video, RCP tends to be on the money a lot more than 538, which is why I trust them a lot more. But taking a look at this race so far, Laxalt has a 1 point lead over Cortez Masto. And again, the Emerson College poll, and Emerson is a very reliable pollster, has Adam Laxalt up by around a point. Now he's regaining the momentum. He had the momentum early on in this race. He was pulling ahead of Cortez Masto, and then there was a period where he was up by a decent amount at the beginning of this year, sort of hit a slump, and now he's sort of regaining the momentum. And that's really the story of the GOP going into the midterms. They had a huge slump in the summer. Dobbs really fired up a lot of Democrats, but since then, we've seen a steady rise in Republicans' polling odds, especially in these key Senate races like Nevada, Pennsylvania, Arizona, as we're going to go into. So ultimately, I'm going to stay consistent with Nevada. I still think Nevada is going to be a flip for the Republican Party. I think Laxalt is an incredibly strong candidate. You know, he came out of a primary that really wasn't that competitive or divisive. He outran incumbent Republican Senator Dean Heller on the exact same ballot in a D+8 environment, which I think is extremely impressive. You know, Dean Heller lost by 5 points as an incumbent. Adam Laxalt only lost by around 4.1%. So Adam Laxalt did better than Dean Heller, despite getting a slightly smaller percentage of the vote. He still overperformed incumbent Senator Dean Heller. So I think he's a really strong candidate, and I think the Republicans will end up flipping this seat in November. Moving on down to Arizona, this is actually a state that I think will be better for the Democrats. They have an incumbent senator, Mark Kelly, who's more popular and more well-known than Cortez Masto. Cortez Masto is somebody that kind of flies under the radar a lot, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the polling she's not doing as well. She's a very low-profile senator. Mark Kelly has certainly made more of a name for himself. He's not as pivotal as somebody like Kyrsten Sinema, and he's not exactly a moderate either, but nonetheless, he still has much wider name recognition and is more well-liked in the state of Arizona than Cortez Masto is in Nevada. But if we take a look at the polls in this race, Kelly is in a stronger position. RCP has Kelly up by 3.3%. 538 again has Kelly up by 8. I think that's sort of ridiculous, especially given the kind of environment we're seeing. Even in 2020, which again was a year where Biden flipped the state of Arizona for the first time in over 20 years, you know, the Senate race only went to Mark Kelly by 2.4%, despite polls having him up by a larger margin. He was up 4, 5, even 6 points in some polls heading into Election Day, and ultimately he only won by 2.4% against a pretty lackluster Republican incumbent. So going into this fall's midterms, I think Blake Masters does have the momentum on his side. Again, he is starting to get money now. Previously, he was having fundraising issues. He was doing very poorly. Mark Kelly has raised a ton of money. But again, when we look at the midterm environment overall, I don't think we're going to see a D plus 4.5 year in 2022. I could basically eliminate that entirely. I think the generic ballot is going to be anywhere from R+2 to D+2. And even in a D+2 environment, that essentially puts the state of Arizona about even. So I think Blake Masters, ever so slightly, is the slight favorite in this race come November. Now, I know now he's still down in the polls, but I think he's going to continue to gain momentum as we get closer. He's gaining momentum in the polls. We're starting to get more reliable polls again. Likely voter polls are much more reliable than some of these registered voter polls, you know, that have Kelly up by insane margins. And again, Kelly being up by 20 points is really unrealistic, and I think really bad for the aggregate overall. I think a Kelly 3.3 polling average now is probably realistic. And again, as we get closer to November, if we're going to take historical polling trends into account, this is going to narrow up. I can almost guarantee that. And I think at the end of the day, Blake Masters will probably end up winning this race by about a point, maybe a bit less. I think it's going to be super, super close. But again, if Donald Trump in a D+4 environment can barely lose the state of Arizona by 0.3%, I find a hard time believing that in a more favorable midterm environment, that Blake Masters wouldn't be able to flip the seat red again. I know it's very controversial to say that is going to be a Republican favored environment, but you know, again, for Democrats to do better in these midterms than 2020 certainly would completely turn on its head all historical political precedent for decades and decades. You have to go back extremely far to find a midterm where the president did a lot better than his previous election performance. And I think Democrats don't have that luck on their side. And we're already starting to see the momentum change. And I think that's likely to continue through to November. Moving on over to the state of Colorado. This is a state that, if it wasn't as blue, I think would be a lot more competitive. Joe O'Dea, the Republican nominee, I think is a great fit for the state of Colorado. He's a social moderate. Of course, he's still fiscally conservative, but he is definitely a better fit for Colorado than what could have been the Republican nominee, Ron Hanks, who was sort of a MAGA far-right candidate who ultimately would have done very poorly in a general election against Michael Bennet. Now, Bennet has a history of outperforming. He won this race in 2010 mainly because his opponent was way further to the right of where the state of Colorado was overall. Now I think he has a much more competent challenger, and currently he's up by around 8.6%. I expect this race to be narrower than that. I think O'Dea probably loses by about 5 points, and I'm going to stand by that, 5.5 points. So I still think Colorado is going to be lean Democratic. O'Dea is a good candidate, but again, the state of Colorado voted for Joe Biden by 13.5 percentage points. So even in a decent swing to the right nationwide in the state of Colorado, it would take a lot, certainly, to flip this state red, and I don't think the national environment nor the Republican Party would be able to do that this year, especially given how partisan politics is today. While I think Joe O'Dea is a good fit for the state, I don't think he could flip the state of Colorado. Moving on over to the state of Wisconsin. Now, this is a state where we have a Republican incumbent. All of these other states have Democratic incumbents so far, but this time we have a state with a Republican incumbent, and currently the polling suggests that the momentum is on Ron Johnson's side, the incumbent, because recently he's starting to lead in the polls again. There was a period back in even just early summer. We've gotten a lot of polls out of Wisconsin lately, but even back in August, Johnson was losing the polls against Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and now we're starting to see the opposite happen where Johnson is actually up. He's up by 4 in Emerson College. We have another poll, big data poll, that has him up by 3. I've been consistently saying Johnson will win this by 5. He always overperforms the polls. Republicans always overperform the polls in Wisconsin. I still think that's likely going to be the case this cycle. Again, we don't really have to bring up the 2016 election, but if we take a look at 2016 for Ron Johnson, this was a year where he was vastly underestimated, and I think we're still likely to see a similar situation play out this time around. Again, throughout the entire election cycle, going back from 2013 all the way to October of 2016, Ron Johnson did not lead in a single poll up until the fall of 2016. And right at the end, of course, he goes on to win the state by nearly 5 percentage points. So I think, given the midterm environment, given the fact that Wisconsin is a rightward trending state, in fact, Donald Trump got a better raw percentage of the vote than he did back in 2016. He got 48.8% in 2016. He got like 47% of the vote in Wisconsin. So definitely an improvement. And again, Johnson is extremely strong in these suburban counties. If we take a look, of course, at his performance in 2016, he was winning these counties by absolutely insane margins, 40, 45%, 37 points, etc. So he was doing really well in these counties. And even with these counties shifting more to the left, because of Trump and because of demographic change and other factors, I still think he's going to overperform Trump's 2020 margins by 5 to 10 points, and I think ultimately that's going to put him over the top. He's probably going to win by around 5 at the end of the day, and I stand by that so far. Moving on over to the state of Ohio. Now, this is a state where I think, again, candidate quality, as I've talked about in other videos, does play a factor in the margin here. The Republican Party overall, I think, nominated weaker candidates. Now, fortunately for them, they're benefiting from a favorable national environment. But again, the Republican Party, I think, could have nominated much stronger candidates for a lot of these seats, and I think Ohio was certainly one of them. Now, I don't really think any of the other primary challengers that were running really would have done any better, but I think J.D. Vance is a poor fit for the state of Ohio. He does run as sort of a populist, but he's hard right on social issues, and Ohio being more of a Rust Belt state really isn't that right-wing on social issues. It's not really the South or anything like that, but he's a very traditionalist, conservative candidate running in Ohio. Now, ultimately, Ohio is a red state. I don't doubt that J.D. Vance will win this race at the end of the day. He's currently up in the polls now by 2.2% according to RCP. I think he's likely to win by a similar margin to Trump's 2020 margin in the state, which was around 8.1%. I think J.D. Vance might slightly underperform. I think he'll probably end up winning by 7 just because I think Tim Ryan will do slightly better in northeastern Ohio where he's from. But I think J.D. Vance will still hold his own in other parts of the state. And, he, like other nominees, has trust issues with the Republican base. He was a never-Trumper for a couple of years into Trump's term. I think it was only 2018 or 2019 that he finally decided to do an about-face on that position. And ultimately, there's still some Republicans that aren't exactly happy with him because of that. But I think, the vast majority of them will come home, and ultimately J.D. Vance will probably end up winning by around 7 points in Ohio. Moving on up to the state of New Hampshire. This is a state where I think if the Republicans nominated the right candidate could potentially be in play. And while Don Bolduc is only down in the polls by around 5 to 6 points, technically he could still make up that ground, but I think it's very unlikely in a state like New Hampshire, a very blue state. A state that rejected Donald Trump by over 7 percentage points. This, used to be the quintessential swing state, but ultimately it is a left-leaning independent state. It's somewhat swingy. The governor's level is red, the state house is red, things like that. But on the presidential and federal level, this is still a blue state. And I think ultimately Don Bolduc was a bad fit for the state of New Hampshire. He's, a very hawkish candidate, very, very pro-MAGA, which isn't really popular in the state of New Hampshire. And ultimately, I think he'll probably end up losing by around 5 percentage points. And New Hampshire is going to be very interesting because Chris Sununu, the incumbent Republican governor, is probably going to win re-election by a simply massive margin. I mean, if we take a look at 2020, Donald Trump loses New Hampshire by 7.3%, but Chris Sununu beats his opponent Dan Feltz by over 32 points. New Hampshire is a huge state for split ticket voting. I expect that to continue. Chris Sununu will still win by a safe margin in the gubernatorial race, but of course in the Senate race, I think is probably +5 in favor of the Democrats. Now, moving on to the state of Pennsylvania. Now, I've often said that Pennsylvania is the key to the Senate this cycle, and I still think that's going to be the case. Whatever party is going to win the Senate, I think will win Pennsylvania. So looking at Pennsylvania, this is probably one of the most covered races of the entire midterm cycle. Dr. Oz being the Republican nominee and John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, being the Democratic nominee, has really taken a lot of the attention away from some of these other more low-profile races, which are still equally as important. States like Nevada, states like even Arizona to an extent. I think Pennsylvania has really taken a lot of the spotlight away from those races because it's really been a very messy and ugly campaign on both sides. And there's a lot at stake. The Senate is at stake in the state of Pennsylvania. And if we take a look at the polls so far out of Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, according to the RCP average, now has a 4-point lead, which is a huge reduction to the leads that he had back in July, the last time I did a Senate prediction where Fetterman was up by 9 or 10 points. And I still had the race going to Dr. Oz at the end of the day. And I think now Dr. Oz is really coalescing the Republican base around him. Now, this is a tough race to pick because really I could see either outcome happening. I could see a situation where enough Republicans in the base stay home and ultimately Dr. Oz loses, and also Mastriano loses because of his weakness in the suburbs. But I could also see a situation in which, like I predicted in the governor's prediction video, Josh Shapiro wins, but Dr. Oz also wins because of his strength in the suburban counties. Now, if we take a look at the 2020 election, Donald Trump really hit sort of his floor in the Philadelphia suburbs, in my opinion. I mean, he lost Chester County by 17.1%. This was a county that just 2 cycles prior, Mitt Romney had narrowly carried, and Pat Toomey actually carried in the 2016 Senate race by over 2 percentage points. So it's a big ticket-splitting county. And, it went to Joe Biden by over 17 points. Montgomery County, Delaware County, Bucks County. These are all counties where Pat Toomey did exceptionally well in. He won Bucks by over 5 points. He won Chester by 2. He only lost Delaware County by a little over 12 points. Montgomery County by around 11 points. So these are counties, again, that on the presidential ballot were much bluer in favor of Hillary Clinton. So you had a decent chunk of Hillary Toomey voters. And I think you could see a situation, and I think it's very likely, that you will have a decent amount of Shapiro-Oz voters in these suburbs as well, because I think Fetterman really did have the advantage earlier on in this race, especially because Dr. Oz was hitting a lot of snags in his campaign. He didn't really have the base behind him. He was making a lot of gaffes that went very viral and really ended up helping Fetterman do a lot of fundraising. But now the momentum, I think, has shifted. The national environment is starting to lurch back in the Republican category once again. Pennsylvania, as a swing state, is starting to be realized in the polling because really this is a state that Joe Biden only won by 1.2%. And Donald Trump was not popular during the 2020 election. This result is the continuation of the trends we've been seeing throughout the Rust Belt, where the rural counties are getting redder. A lot of these white working class counties are getting redder, while the suburbs are getting bluer. And ultimately, it was the margins in not just the suburbs, but also across northeastern Pennsylvania that really won Joe Biden the state of Pennsylvania back in 2020. And 2022, I think, is probably going to be a year where you see a Republican hold on to this Senate race. And one of the reasons I say that also is because Republicans have consistently led in the generic ballot polls out of Pennsylvania. Commonly, they're leading by 3, 4, even 5 percentage points, and I expect that to be fairly accurate, especially since the Republicans won the generic ballot back in 2016, back in 2014. And Pennsylvania, again, is a ticket-splitting state. So while Dr. Oz is still down in the polls, he's only down by an average of 4 points. And if this momentum continues, again, he's only rising at this point, I think he's likely to end up pulling it out. And I think his coalition of victory is going to look very much like Pat Toomey's, not like Donald Trump's. So, overperformance in the suburbs, having much weaker showings in the rural areas, because again, there's a lot of rural MAGA far-right voters that really don't trust Dr. Oz, that think he's a social liberal. We're fans of Kathy Barnett, who hasn't endorsed Dr. Oz, and ultimately I still think that's going to hurt him. But given the amount of money and given the amount of ads and the campaign he's been running, Dr. Oz has been campaigning all over the state of Pennsylvania, a lot more than John Fetterman has. John Fetterman had a stroke back in May. He really hasn't been doing a lot of campaigning since, likely due to him recovering from that. But nonetheless, I think a Dr. Oz victory is probably slightly more likely at this rate if current trends continue. And again, things could change by October. But if this momentum continues in Oz's favor, I think he ends up winning the Pennsylvania Senate race by around 1.5% at the end of the day. Moving on down to North Carolina, I've consistently had North Carolina going in favor of the Republicans. Ted Budd, I think, was an exceptional nominee. Very strong candidate. Again, really didn't have a contentious primary. Sherry Beasley was the former Supreme Court Justice in the state of North Carolina, the state Supreme Court Justice. She ended up losing re-election back in 2020, despite it being a D+ for environment nationwide, and that's ultimately why I didn't think she was necessarily the strongest candidate. Historically, polls have underrepresented Republicans throughout cycle after cycle. We saw that in 2014 and 2016. And in 2020, Joe Biden was up in the polls in North Carolina. And even back in 2020, I said Donald Trump would win North Carolina. He ended up winning. I said Tillis would win North Carolina in 2020. He ended up winning. So I think at this rate, there's certainly no question that Ted Budd's going to win this race. I think he still wins it by around 6 points at the end of the day. I think at this rate, he has the momentum on his side. Sherry Beasley is up in some of the polls, but again, that's mainly due to oversampling of Democratic voters, and I've said that consistently. If you look back at the polling for North Carolina, it always oversamples Democrats. So the fact that Ted Budd is up by 1.6% in RCP this early on, I think he's only going to gain in the polling average as we get closer. So I think this is a likely Republican hold in North Carolina. Moving on down to the state of Georgia. Now, Georgia is different from all of these other states because Georgia employs a runoff system if neither candidate gets over 50% of the vote. Now, if we take a look at the polling in Georgia, like what's been going on in the rest of these swing states, the Republican Herschel Walker has been gaining momentum. Of course, we've had some recent registered voter polls that have put Herschel Walker slightly down, but up until then, he was sort of gaining back the momentum in early September, and I'm actually surprised how many Georgia polls that we've had, because it seems like Raphael Warnock has started to lead in some of them, but again, some of these polls where he's up by 13, 14 points, I think is kind of ridiculous, but Warnock is up in the RCP average now by just 0.3%, which essentially means that this race is a dead heat between the two candidates, and I think Warnock, like Kelly, is a pretty strong incumbent. There's going to be a fair amount of Kemp-Warnock voters, especially in the Atlanta suburbs. If we take a look at Georgia's election results back in 2020, Joe Biden won the state of Georgia by 0.2%, and he got the best margins in the Atlanta suburbs for a Democrat probably since Jimmy Carter. So, you know, looking at these races, looking at the down ballot Senate race, which we're going to take a look at with David Perdue, which if the runoff system had not happened, David Perdue would have been reelected to the Senate by a margin of 1.8% over John Ossoff. But unfortunately for him, that wasn't the system that Georgia has. And ultimately, if neither candidate gets 50% in Georgia, they're going to have to go to a runoff as well. So I'm not going to predict how the runoff is going to go because, of course, we don't even know who's going to win the first round. I think it's likely that Herschel Walker is going to have more votes the first time around than Raphael Warnock. It's just really a question of whether he's going to get over 50% of the vote to avoid a runoff, because a runoff is going to be, you know, very, very interesting because, you know, that really is a pure toss-up. I actually think Warnock is slightly favored because the Democrats have been gaining with more suburban educated voters, and those are voters that tend to turn out more in off-year and special elections. That's one of the reasons why I think a lot of the recent special elections have gone in favor of the Democrats. You've also had Dobbs sort of energizing Democrats as well. That's certainly a factor. As of right now, I still think Walker is a slight favorite here in Georgia. Warnock is only up by 0.3%. I think he needs to be up by more than that this early on because I think the polls are going to continue to be razor thin, if not tighten, in favor of Walker at the end of the day. Again, we had a couple of polls literally last week or 2 weeks ago that had Walker up ahead. Now Warnock is up ahead. It really is a dead heat. But given the national environment, given the fact that I think Kemp is going to perform pretty well against Stacey Abrams, I think the down ballot coattails might just be enough to save Walker, which is why I'm going to give him Georgia ultimately by a 2-point margin. I think Walker will be able to recapture this seat. I think Warnock, a more favorable national environment to hold on. But again, a lot of this can change. Republicans are building momentum now. I think that's certainly something that could change in a month from now when I release my next prediction on this. Finally, we go down to the state of Florida. I don't know why we've had so many bad polls out of the state of Florida. You know, Val Demings is not going to win in the state of Florida, but yet there's a lot of polls that have her within the margin of error. Marco Rubio is an incredibly popular and strong Republican incumbent. You know, he won by really large margins in 2016. He massively overperformed Donald Trump in 2016, of course, in 2010. With Charlie Crist on the ballot, he performed exceptionally well. He won by nearly 20 points, mostly due to vote splitting. But looking ahead at 2022, this November, he's certainly a large favorite for this race. And even pollsters have kept this race as likely or lean are, despite the fact that we've had some weird polls where Val Demings is actually ahead of Marco Rubio. So taking into account, of course, Florida's rightward drift, as well as the fact that this is still expected to be a better midterm year for Republicans than 2020 was, you know, I think Marco Rubio probably holds on. I'm going to move it out of the safe category. I've had Florida as safe red for a while. I think that's being a little bit too generous to Marco Rubio. I think at the end of the day, he probably wins by 10. DeSantis probably wins by 8. And that's kind of how I see things. So as of right now for the month of September, I've got Republicans at 53 seats, Democrats at 47. Again, when I looked at a lot of these states, I took into account national trends, the national environment, as well as the individual trends for these states. The Rust Belt states are still trending more to the red. Candidate quality is a factor, but I think when, particularly in Pennsylvania, where I think the Democrat is really struggling there, he's sort of losing the momentum that I think he had earlier on in the race. Of course, Abrams really has sort of collapsed. She never led in a single poll, still isn't leading in a poll. So we have Democrats around the country. I think you're starting to see that post-Dobbs bump sort of recede, I think, a little bit. Especially since I think Republicans are starting to gain more energy, start to be more engaged in politics. And we're seeing that reflected in the polls. The polls are undoubtedly getting closer in these races. And if these trends continue, Republicans will have a pretty decent night both in the House and the Senate. So anyway, that's it for today's video. We're going to start doing our individual House predictions. So like we did last time, we're going to be dividing the U.S. up into regions and looking at the individual House districts in those races. Of course, I think these predictions are going to be a lot more accurate and more analytical than the ones I released back over the summer when in some races we didn't even know who the nominees were, and now we know who all of the nominees are for the various House seats, and I think I can give a more accurate projection as to where I think those races will end up going. So stay tuned for that. We'll have those videos coming out in the coming weeks. We'll have some of them sort of spread out throughout the cycle. And of course, we're going to be closely watching the rest of these midterm races going into more individual states as we get closer. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, like this video down below. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe down below. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.